People have been warning about the end of the world for thousands of years. Every generation has had its prophets, preachers, mystics, and self-proclaimed visionaries who insisted that the final hour was just around the corner. Yet here we are, still waiting for an ending that never seems to arrive. It's easy to dismiss these predictions as the work of fringe voices, but history shows that end times forecasts have always attracted serious attention. They've influenced entire cultures, led to mass movements, and even shaped major events, from the apocalyptic expectations in the first century to modern televangelists selling survival kits. People have been consistently convinced that their generation would be the last. The strange part isn't that these predictions exist, it's that they keep failing over and over, and yet they never lose their appeal. When one date passes without incident, another date is quickly offered, the pattern repeats, and followers still gather around the same kind of promises even after disappointment. So the question isn't just why these predictions fail, but why people continue to believe them despite a record of total inaccuracy. Part of the answer lies in the psychology of human beings. We're wired to look for patterns, to anticipate threats, and to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The idea that the world might end soon speaks to deep fears we carry about mortality, chaos, and the unknown. It offers a sense of clarity in a confusing world. When someone claims to have the inside knowledge of when history will close, it feels like an anchor in turbulent waters, even if the anchor is imaginary. There's also the appeal of urgency. If the end is near, then suddenly life feels more meaningful. Every choice matters. Every day carries weight. That urgency is intoxicating because it transforms ordinary struggles into cosmic battles. Believing the world is ending can make people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. Like they're living in the most important chapter of history. Religions have tapped into this psychology from the very beginning. The Hebrew Bible is filled with warnings about destruction and final judgment. Early Christians believed Jesus would return within their lifetime. In fact, some of his followers were convinced that the end was so near there was no need to plan for the future at all. But decades passed, generations died, and the promise of a quick ending kept being pushed further away. Instead of abandoning the belief, religious communities reinterpreted it. When predictions failed, new explanations were created. Maybe the signs were misread. Maybe God delayed the timeline. Maybe it was symbolic instead of literal. The failed prophecy was not seen as proof that the idea itself was false, but rather that human understanding was limited. And so the cycle continued. We can see the same pattern in more recent times. The Millerite movement in the 1800s is a classic example. Followers of William Miller believed the world would end in 1844. They sold possessions, left farms unplanted, and waited for Jesus in what became known as the Great Disappointment. When nothing happened, many abandoned the movement, but others reinterpreted the prophecy and gave birth to new denominations. The failure didn't kill the idea, it reshaped it. In the 20th century, predictions multiplied with the rise of mass media. Radio preachers, best-selling authors, and eventually television evangelists made apocalyptic warnings part of mainstream conversation. From the Cold War to the Y2K scare, from Hal Lindsey's late Great Planet Earth to Harold Camping's failed rapture predictions in 2011, each warning gathered headlines and followers, and each failed without consequence. And yet, despite the track record, the next warning always finds an audience. Why? Because these predictions don't survive on accuracy. They survive on hope and fear. They give people the illusion of certainty in an uncertain world. And when that illusion collapses, many cling tighter instead of letting go. Social psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. When a belief is proven wrong, abandoning it is painful, so the mind finds ways to adjust instead. Followers may tell themselves that the prediction was spiritually fulfilled or that the delay is part of a divine plan. In a way, the failed prophecy becomes a test of faith rather than a refutation of it. This is why apocalyptic groups can become even stronger after their predictions collapse. There's also the fact that predicting the end of the world brings power to those making the claims. A preacher who says the world will end soon can command attention, loyalty, and often money. Urgency makes followers dependent. It convinces them to act now, give now, obey now. And so the incentive for leaders to make these predictions never disappears, even if their accuracy is 0%. But beyond the psychological and financial angles, there's another layer, the cultural context. End times predictions tend to surge in moments of upheaval. Times of war, disease, famine, or social instability make people more willing to believe that history itself is breaking down. When the world feels fragile, the idea of a final collapse seems more plausible. And so, every generation interprets its own troubles as the ultimate signs of the end. This means that the failure of predictions isn't surprising at all, because they were never based on objective evidence in the first place. They're reflections of human anxiety, cultural fear, and religious imagination. And when those forces continue, so do the predictions. What's fascinating is how flexible these forecasts are. Every war becomes the war described in prophecy. Every natural disaster is a sign of judgment. Every new technology is suspected to be the mark of the beast. This adaptability keeps the narrative alive even when specific claims collapse. In the end, failed predictions reveal more about human psychology than about the universe. They show how deeply people want answers, even wrong ones, rather than live with uncertainty. And they show how powerful a story can be, even when it never comes true. When we look back at history, the failed prophecies line up like dominoes, but each one, in its time, felt urgent and undeniable to its followers. Take the year 1000, for example. Medieval Europe was filled with speculation that the end would arrive as the calendar turned to the new millennium. Famines, plagues, and wars were interpreted as divine warnings. Pilgrimages surged, churches filled, and people gave away their wealth in preparation. But when the year passed without global catastrophe, life continued as it always had. The supposed apocalypse faded into memory, and the next generation carried the same fears forward into new timelines. The same happened in the 1660s when the Great Fire of London, combined with a plague outbreak, convinced many that the final judgment was near. Pamphlets circulated, sermons warned, and even educated people saw the disasters as proof of biblical prophecy. But London rebuilt, the plague subsided, and once again, the timeline was reset. The world kept moving. Fast forward to the 20th century, when technology added new fuel to apocalyptic thinking. Nuclear weapons gave humanity, for the first time, the actual power to destroy itself. And so the ancient religious warnings found a frightening new stage. The Cold War became a fertile ground for end times predictions. Every missile test and political crisis was cast as evidence that biblical prophecies were unfolding. But once again, the world didn't end. The Soviet Union collapsed, the arms race cooled, and yet the predictions simply shifted to new crises. One striking example is the panic around the year 2000. The so-called Y2K bug sparked fears that computer systems would fail at midnight, sending planes crashing and power grids collapsing. While not strictly religious, many tied this technological fear to biblical warnings. Survival kits sold out, underground bunkers were prepared, and apocalyptic books hit bestseller lists. But when midnight came and went, only a few minor glitches occurred. It became another entry in the long list of failed doomsday scenarios. But notice something, even after the Y2K failure, apocalyptic literature didn't disappear. In fact, the Left Behind book series was booming at the time, selling millions of copies and shaping popular culture with visions of rapture and destruction. The hunger for end-time stories was stronger than the disappointment of failed predictions. And that tells us something important. It shows that these predictions aren't about accuracy, they're about desire. People want the world to make sense, and they want their lives to matter in the grand scheme of things. Apocalyptic belief delivers both. It says history is heading toward a climax, that the chaos will be resolved, and that those who believe are on the winning side. That's a powerful promise, one that keeps believers loyal even when reality refuses to cooperate. But there's another side to this. Failed predictions don't just fade quietly, they leave behind real consequences. When people sell their homes, quit their jobs, or neglect their families because they're convinced the world is about to end, the damage doesn't vanish when the prophecy collapses. Many lives have been upended by false certainty. The Millerites in the 19th century faced poverty and ridicule after the Great Disappointment. Followers of Harold Camping, who believed the world would end in May 2011, drained savings, left careers, and gave away possessions, only to wake up the next day and realize life was going on without them. The emotional toll of that kind of disillusionment is devastating. Some left religion entirely, while others doubled down and reinterpreted the failure. And then there are the tragic cases where predictions lead to catastrophe. Groups like Heaven's Gate in the 1990s ended in mass suicide after their leaders convinced them that salvation depended on leaving their bodies behind. The Jonestown tragedy, while not a traditional end times prediction, drew on similar themes of imminent doom and escape from a collapsing world. These examples remind us that failed prophecies aren't harmless entertainment. They can manipulate, exploit, and destroy lives. Even when the consequences aren't extreme, there's a subtler damage, and failed predictions erode trust in reason, encourage fatalism, and spread fear. When people are convinced the end is near, they may withdraw from civic responsibility, abandon plans for the future, or neglect efforts to improve the world. Why invest in education, healthcare, or climate action if you believe the earth will be destroyed next year? This is how apocalyptic thinking can undermine real solutions to real problems. Yet, despite all this, the cycle persists. Why? Because each new generation faces its own crises, and each crisis feels unprecedented. Pandemics, wars, and climate disasters make people feel like history itself is unraveling, and religious leaders are always ready to frame these events as proof that prophecy is unfolding at last. They can even recycle the same passages, the same warnings, with just enough modern context to make it feel urgent again. This recycling is key. The Bible verses used to predict the end are vague, symbolic, and open to endless reinterpretation. Wars and earthquakes have happened in every century. Famines and diseases are part of human history. So when a preacher points to a verse and then to the evening news, the connection looks convincing, even though the same verse was used 100 years ago to describe a completely different crisis. In this way, prophecy becomes a mirror. It reflects the fears of the moment rather than predicting the future. The fact that it fails repeatedly doesn't weaken its grip because its power doesn't come from truth. It comes from resonance with the anxieties people already feel. Think about how flexible these predictions have always been. In the Middle Ages, people feared the Black Death as a sign of the end. In the 20th century, it was nuclear war. In the 21st, climate change, pandemics, and artificial intelligence have all been folded into apocalyptic narratives. Each age takes its unique anxieties and pastes them onto ancient prophecies, as though those vague lines in Scripture were written specifically about today. The trick is that the text never actually changes, only the interpretation does. This flexibility is what makes end times predictions nearly indestructible. They're like a shadow, always shifting, always fitting the shape of whatever fears people already carry. A war breaks out, that must be the war of Armageddon. A disease spreads, that must be pestilence foretold in the Bible. A new technology emerges, that must be the mark of the beast. The same verses have been recycled endlessly to fit every age, yet they never deliver on their supposed promise of accuracy. And here's the irony. The very fact that predictions fail is often turned into proof of faith. Leaders and believers tell themselves that the prophecy was fulfilled in a spiritual way, or that God postponed judgment to give humanity more time to repent. Instead of seeing the failure as disconfirmation, it's reframed as an even deeper mystery. This makes the prophecy unfalsifiable. No matter what happens or doesn't happen, the belief can still survive. Psychologists studying religious movements noticed this long ago. In the 1950s, a team of researchers infiltrated a small apocalyptic group that believed the world would end on a specific date. When the prophecy failed, the group didn't collapse as expected. Instead, many members became more committed. They rationalized that their prayers had saved the world from destruction. What looked like a defeat was turned into a victory in their minds. The researchers documented this as one of the clearest examples of cognitive dissonance at work. This isn't just a quirk of small cults. The same dynamic plays out in mainstream religion. When Jesus didn't return in the first century as many of his followers expected, new interpretations emerged. Maybe he came spiritually rather than physically. Maybe his return was delayed until humanity was ready. Maybe the signs were symbolic instead of literal. These reinterpretations allowed Christianity to survive and grow, despite its earliest promises failing to materialize. And here we are, 2,000 years later, still hearing the same claims that the end is imminent, still seeing the same verses used as proof, still watching dates set and then quietly abandoned when they pass. If accuracy mattered, apocalyptic predictions would have died centuries ago. But accuracy isn't the point. The point is emotional impact. Apocalyptic belief gives people a sense of urgency, purpose, and control in a chaotic world. It transforms random suffering into meaningful events. It provides villains and heroes, winners and losers, and a promised resolution to all the injustice in life. In a world where bad people often thrive and good people suffer, the idea of a coming judgment feels comforting. It says no one escapes justice, that history has a moral arc, and that the faithful will be rewarded. That kind of promise is hard to resist, even if it never comes true. But the problem is that it distracts from reality. Instead of dealing with human-caused problems like war, inequality, or environmental destruction, and apocalyptic thinking shifts the blame to divine judgment. Instead of working to make life better here and now, believers wait for the sky to crack open, and waiting can be dangerous. And history shows how damaging this can be. In the 1970s, during another wave of apocalyptic excitement, many Christians were told not to bother pursuing education or careers because the end was supposedly so close. Some didn't save for retirement, didn't invest in the future, and discouraged their children from planning long term. Decades later, many of those same people found themselves struggling financially and disillusioned. Their lives had been shaped by a failed promise, and the consequences were real. This is what makes failed end times predictions more than just harmless mistakes. They rob people of opportunities. They can destroy families, drain bank accounts, and leave scars of disappointment. They also shape entire societies. If large numbers of people believe the world is about to end, they're less likely to support policies that require long-term planning, like addressing climate change or investing in education. The mindset of why bother, it's all going to burn, weakens collective responsibility. And yet, despite all this, the allure never goes away. New leaders step in, new books are written, new dates are set. Each failure is buried under the next wave of predictions, and the cycle spins on. If we step back, the pattern is unmistakable. Every failed prophecy leaves behind two groups, those who walk away and those who cling even harder. The ones who leave often feel betrayed, and some abandon religious belief altogether. The ones who stay usually become more loyal to their leaders, convinced that their endurance is proof of true faith. This polarization ensures that apocalyptic movements don't just survive failure, they sometimes grow stronger because of it. The more we study this cycle, the clearer it becomes that failed end times predictions reveal far more about human psychology and social behavior than about the universe. They show us our hunger for meaning, our discomfort with uncertainty, and our willingness to accept almost any explanation rather than admit we were wrong. It's worth looking closely at the way failed predictions get explained away. There's almost always a script. First, the leader sets a date or declares that certain events mark the final countdown. Then followers prepare, often sacrificing time, money, and relationships in the process. When the date passes uneventfully, the leader pivots. They claim the calculation was slightly off, or that the prophecy was fulfilled in a hidden spiritual way. Sometimes they even argue that the prediction's failure was a test of loyalty, and remarkably, many followers accept it. This cycle works because it plays on a deep human need for certainty, Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Not knowing when or how life ends or what the future holds can cause real anxiety. Prophecy offers an escape from that discomfort. It says, don't worry, the story has already been written and you're part of it. When reality refuses to line up with that script, people often prefer to adjust the interpretation rather than face the unsettling truth that the script itself might be fiction. We can see this at work in modern evangelical culture. Though throughout the 20th century, prominent preachers declared the end was imminent. Some pointed to World War I, others to World War II. Later, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was hailed as the decisive sign that prophecy was unfolding. Decade after decade, new proofs were offered. Each time, people were convinced. Each time, the world kept turning. One of the most influential voices was Hal Lindsey, whose 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth, sold millions of copies, and he confidently claimed that the end would come before the year 2000. The book scared countless readers and shaped an entire generation's view of the future. But when the year 2000 came and went, the prediction was quietly forgotten. Lindsay didn't lose his platform, though. He kept publishing and people kept buying. That tells us that accuracy was never the key factor. It was the story, the emotional resonance that mattered. The same happened with Harold Camping, who predicted the rapture in 2011. Billboards went up across the United States, radio broadcasts spread the message, and followers invested huge sums of money to spread the word. When the date arrived with no event, the group faced ridicule, but Camping insisted the prophecy had been fulfilled spiritually and adjusted the timeline. Even after he admitted his mistake, some of his followers stayed loyal. The prediction failed, but the psychological grip of the narrative remained. These examples raise an uncomfortable question. If the record of failure is so clear, why do people keep trusting the next prediction? Part of the answer lies in selective memory. Humans are remarkably good at forgetting failures and highlighting moments that feel validating. If a preacher predicts disaster and a war breaks out, even if it's unrelated, followers may see that as confirmation while conveniently ignoring the times when nothing happened at all. In this way, apocalyptic movements survive not just through reinterpretation, but through selective attention. Another factor is the way apocalyptic belief can make people feel special. To believe you're living in the end times is to believe you're at the center of history. You're not just another human living a quiet life. You are part of the climax of the universe. That sense of importance is powerful. And when a prediction fails, it doesn't erase that feeling. Followers often cling tighter because they don't want to lose the significance they've been given. There's also the way communities form around these beliefs. Being part of a group that shares an urgent conviction creates bonds. It gives people a sense of belonging and identity. To walk away after a failed prophecy often means losing not just a belief, but an entire community. That social cost is high, and so many prefer to stay, even if doubts creep in. Loyalty to the group often outweighs loyalty to reality. But while all of this explains why predictions survive failure, it doesn't make them harmless. On the contrary, the history of failed end times movements is littered with damage. Families broken apart, financial ruin, psychological trauma, and in extreme cases, violence and death. Even when the outcomes aren't so dramatic, there's the quiet erosion of trust and the wasted years spent preparing for a future that never came. What's especially striking is how the cycle has adapted in the digital age. Social media has turbocharged apocalyptic thinking. Now predictions spread instantly to millions, amplified by algorithms that reward fear and outrage. Videos and posts warning of imminent collapse rack up millions of views, often blending biblical prophecy with conspiracy theories about governments, technology, or vaccines. The result is a constant flood of proof that the end is near. And yet, just like before, the predictions keep failing. Whether it's supposed to be the blood moons, the Mayan calendar in 2012, or the alignment of planets, none of it has delivered. The difference now is that failed prophecies are quickly drowned out by the next wave of viral warnings. The cycle has accelerated, but the pattern remains unchanged. This endless churn shows us something important. Apocalyptic thinking isn't really about predicting the future. It's about managing fear in the present. It's about finding meaning in chaos, even if that meaning is built on shaky ground. And as long as people crave that certainty, there will always be someone ready to sell it to them. The danger of the cycle isn't just that predictions fail, it's that they redirect energy away from real issues. When people believe the world is ending, they are less likely to engage in long-term solutions. Why fight climate change if the earth is destined to burn anyway? Why address inequality if justice will come only through divine intervention? Why build for the future if the future itself is doomed? This fatalistic mindset allows real problems to fester while attention is locked on imaginary timelines. We can see this in the way certain religious communities approach politics. Instead of seeing global challenges as human-made problems that demand human solutions, they're framed as proof that prophecy is unfolding. Wars and disasters become signs of God's plan, not crises to be prevented. In this way, apocalyptic thinking can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because the world is ending, but because urgent problems are ignored until they spiral out of control. Another overlooked consequence is how apocalyptic predictions breed distrust. When leaders repeatedly announce dates for the end and nothing happens, cynicism spreads. Some believers quietly leave, but others stay, suspicious of outsiders and hostile toward critics. This creates a bubble where reality is filtered out, and only voices that reinforce the narrative are trusted. That isolation makes the group more radical and more resistant to correction. The persistence of these beliefs also highlights the human struggle with uncertainty. Most of us prefer a painful certainty over an open-ended unknown. It's easier to believe the world ends on a specific date, even if wrong, than to accept that no one knows how history will unfold. That desire for definite answers is what keeps failed predictions alive. They're not credible, but they're comforting. And comfort is a powerful force. Take the prediction around 2012 tied to the Mayan calendar. Millions around the world became convinced something catastrophic or transformative would happen on December 21st. Books, movies, and documentaries spread the idea. Some believed it would be physical destruction, others that it would mark a new spiritual age. When the day passed quietly, many simply laughed it off. But during those years leading up to it, the idea had captured global imagination, selling millions of products and dominating media. It didn't matter that scholars had long debunked the claim. What mattered was the emotional pull of a countdown to something extraordinary. That same pull exists in every era. The excitement of thinking you're living in the last chapter of history is difficult to resist. It gives everyday events cosmic significance. It transforms news headlines into divine signals, and it makes ordinary people feel like chosen participants in a grand story. That's far more thrilling than admitting life will go on, messy and unpredictable, long after we're gone. Yet, if we look honestly at the track record, the failure rate is absolute. No prediction of the end has ever come true, none, not in ancient times, not in medieval Europe, not in the modern era. The evidence is overwhelming, but it doesn't seem to matter, because for many, the comfort of belief outweighs the burden of evidence. What this tells us is that failed end times predictions aren't really about truth at all. They're about identity, meaning, and control. They offer a story that explains everything and promises resolution. Even when wrong, that story feels better than no story. But there's another layer to consider: the role of authority. When a charismatic leader claims to know the future, they gain enormous influence. Followers often trust them more than their own experiences or reasoning. This dynamic can become dangerous quickly because it concentrates power in the hands of those willing to manipulate fear. The failed prediction isn't seen as the leader's mistake. It's seen as the follower's misunderstanding. And so the cycle continues with the same authority figures still in charge. It's striking how often these leaders profit from their predictions. Books, speaking tours, donations, and media appearances generate revenue regardless of accuracy. Selling fear of the end can be extremely lucrative. And because the product is intangible, a future catastrophe, there's no accountability when it doesn't arrive. Followers rarely demand refunds. They simply move on to the next book, the next sermon, the next video. This reveals the business model of apocalypse. It thrives not on accuracy, but on drama. The scarier the warning, the more attention it draws, and attention translates into money and power. In this sense, failed predictions are not failures for the leaders. They're opportunities. Each new date is a chance to re-engage the audience, to reignite the urgency, to sell more certainty. The irony is that while the predictions never come true, the fears they exploit are real. War, disease, environmental collapse, these are genuine threats. But instead of addressing them with practical solutions, apocalyptic thinking distorts them into signs of prophecy. Real problems get co-opted into an imaginary script, which prevents people from facing them honestly. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of failed end times predictions. They distract from the fact that while the universe isn't ending tomorrow, the choices we make today still shape the future. By obsessing over imaginary apocalypse, people neglect the real challenges that could actually determine whether humanity thrives or collapses. When we study these predictions, a pattern becomes clear. They never actually die, they just evolve. The failed prophecy is quietly reframed, and new details are added to fit the latest crisis. Leaders rarely admit defeat. Instead, they claim deeper insight, saying the timeline was misunderstood or that the world is still on the edge, but God delayed judgment out of mercy. This way, the narrative never collapses. It just stretches further into the future. That's why end times predictions have lasted across cultures for thousands of years. They're not really about events. They're about storytelling. And like any powerful story, they're endlessly adaptable. A tale of judgment and salvation can be retold in countless ways, molded to fit every age. It's why the same scriptures that once proved Rome was about to fall can later prove that the European Union is the beast, or that microchips are the mark, or that climate disasters are divine punishment. The core story doesn't change, only the details. But adaptability doesn't equal truth. If a prediction can always be reshaped to match whatever's happening, then it's not a prediction at all. It's a Rorschach test. It tells us more about the interpreter than about the future. And yet, because it resonates with deep fears and hopes, it keeps pulling people in. This is why we need to ask what lies beneath the predictions. Why do people want the end to come so badly? Why is the idea of final judgment more appealing than the idea of a long, uncertain future? Part of it is the longing for justice. In a world where injustice often goes unpunished, the promise of a cosmic reckoning feels satisfying. If the wicked seem to win in this life, then surely the scales will be balanced in the next. The apocalypse offers that guarantee. Another part is the craving for meaning. Life can feel random, unfair, and chaotic, but if history is heading toward a predetermined climax, then suffering has purpose. Every war, every disaster, every loss is not just meaningless tragedy. It's part of the plan. That sense of purpose can be comforting, even when built on shaky ground. And then there's the fear of death. On an individual level, we all face mortality. The apocalypse magnifies that personal fear into a cosmic event. If everyone dies together, then death feels less lonely. It becomes part of a grand story rather than a solitary end. For some, that's less frightening, but comfort doesn't equal truth either. And when comfort comes at the cost of reality, it can become dangerous. Because while people wait for divine intervention, human problems multiply. While believers watch the sky for signs, they overlook the very real power they already have to shape the future. It's not as though humanity needs prophecy to imagine. Catastrophe. History is filled with collapses of civilizations from Rome to the Maya to Easter Island. None of these collapses were cosmic judgments. They were the result of human choices, environmental strain, and political failure. If anything, they show that the end of societies comes not from prophecy, but from neglect and mismanagement. And yet, Even these lessons get pulled into apocalyptic thinking. Instead of seeing history as evidence of human responsibility, believers use it as proof that divine prophecy is being fulfilled. Every empire that falls, every disaster that strikes, is claimed as confirmation of the ancient script. The possibility that humans cause their own problems without divine intervention is rarely considered in these circles. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of failed predictions is what happens afterward. Life goes on. The crops still need planting. Bills still need paying. Children still need raising. Reality reasserts itself, often brutally. And for some, that realization sparks disillusionment. They see the gap between the promise and the outcome, and they step away. Others, however, double down, convinced that their faith is being tested. The same failure that pushes some out strengthens the loyalty of others. This dynamic ensures the survival of apocalyptic belief, even in the face of absolute failure. It splits people into two paths, skepticism or radicalization. And because communities are often built around the latter, the movement keeps momentum. Each failed prophecy doesn't kill the idea, it simply prunes the group, leaving behind only the most committed. If we think about it, that's a remarkable survival strategy, a belief system that becomes stronger every time it's proven wrong. It's almost immune to evidence, and that makes it especially resilient. But resilience doesn't mean harmlessness. Each failure leaves behind real scars, emotional, financial, and social. Each cycle wastes human potential, steering people away from investing in the present. And when entire communities, sometimes millions strong, live as though the end is imminent, the collective cost is enormous. The pattern will continue as long as the underlying needs, fear, meaning, justice, control, remain unanswered by more grounded solutions. And so the challenge is not just exposing failed predictions, but offering better ways to confront those human needs. Because until people have healthier ways to deal with fear, uncertainty, and injustice, apocalyptic prophecies will always find fertile ground. Another reason these failed predictions continue to find traction is that they provide a simple narrative in a complicated world. Complexity can be overwhelming. Global politics, economics, science, and social issues are often messy and interconnected. It's hard to understand why things happen the way they do, but apocalyptic stories flatten all that. Complexity into a single plotline, good versus evil, God versus Satan, believers versus unbelievers. Everything suddenly makes sense because everything fits into the same framework. That simplicity is seductive. It saves people from the exhausting task of grappling with nuance. You don't have to analyze climate science or geopolitics or public health policy. You just have to recognize that all of it points toward the same inevitable ending. For those already overwhelmed, then this is a shortcut to clarity. But clarity bought through distortion is dangerous. It's also important to recognize how these predictions play on tribal instincts. Believing the world is about to end doesn't just make history meaningful, it also divides humanity into insiders and outsiders, those who see the signs and those who don't, those who will be saved and those who won't. That sense of belonging to the chosen few strengthens loyalty to the group, making it harder to question even when predictions collapse. Because questioning the prophecy doesn't just mean doubting an idea, it means risking exclusion from the tribe. And exclusion can be terrifying. Social belonging is a basic human need, and apocalyptic groups often provide tight-knit communities where everyone shares the same worldview. Leaving means losing friends, mentors, sometimes even family. For many, it's easier to stay and reinterpret a failed prophecy than to walk away and face isolation. This social glue explains why even spectacular failures, like Harold Camping's prediction or the Millerite Great Disappointment, didn't end the movements. Instead, they splintered into smaller but still devoted groups that carried the torch forward. When we zoom out, failed end times predictions can be seen as case studies in human resilience, but resilience in the wrong direction. Instead of adapting to reality, people adapt reality to their belief. They bend the world around the prophecy, even when the evidence is screaming otherwise. That flexibility ensures the prophecy never truly dies, even though its track record is nothing but failure. Consider the way world events are constantly reframed. During the Gulf War in the 1990s, many American preachers claimed Saddam Hussein was a key figure in biblical prophecy. When that war ended, attention shifted to new conflicts, with new villains cast in the prophetic role: Osama bin Laden, then ISIS, then political leaders, then global organizations. The names change, but the story remains the same. Every crisis is treated as if it were the final one, until the next crisis takes its place. This reveals a deeper truth. Predictions don't survive because they're accurate. They survive because the world always has problems that can be used to fuel them. There will always be wars, always disasters, always corruption. And as long as those exist, someone will be ready to say, "See, this proves the end is near." But here's the crucial question: why does the end is near feel more satisfying than the world has always been messy? Because the former gives closure, while the latter offers only open-ended struggle. Closure feels final, dramatic, even cleansing. It promises that suffering has an expiration date, that injustice won't last forever. That's much more emotionally appealing than accepting that the world will keep being complicated, unjust, and unpredictable long after we're gone. This emotional appeal helps explain why failed prophecies don't discredit themselves. People don't approach them like scientific hypotheses, where failure means rejection. They approach them like stories, where failure is just a plot twist that sets up the next chapter. The timeline shifts, the characters change, but the story continues, and stories are sticky. They stay with us in ways that raw facts don't. You can tell someone that every single prediction has failed, but if they're already invested in the story, that fact won't matter. It might even make them double down, because acknowledging failure threatens the meaning they've built their life around. This is why arguing against failed predictions with data alone often doesn't work. The appeal isn't rational. It's emotional and social. To undermine the cycle, you'd have to offer people a different story, one that meets the same needs without relying on false promises. That's not easy, but it may be the only way forward. The persistence of apocalyptic belief also highlights how humans deal with fear of the unknown. When faced with uncertainty about the future, many would rather believe a terrifying certainty than live with ambiguity. The idea of knowing, even if it's knowing the world will end, is less frightening than admitting we don't know what's coming. This psychological quirk makes us vulnerable to anyone who confidently claims to have answers, and leaders know this. That's why end times predictions are so often delivered with absolute certainty, not maybe or possibly, but this is what will happen. That tone of authority is persuasive, especially to those already craving stability in a chaotic world. The more confidently a leader speaks, the more followers are willing to overlook past failures. Certainty becomes more valuable than truth. This reliance on certainty explains why failed predictions don't necessarily weaken a leader's grip. In fact, sometimes failure strengthens it. When the promised apocalypse doesn't come, followers may feel embarrassed or disoriented, but instead of blaming the leader, they often blame themselves. Maybe they didn't have enough faith. Maybe they misunderstood the prophecy. Maybe God changed the plan at the last minute. By redirecting the blame inward, they preserve trust in the leader who can then continue guiding them. This dynamic has been studied in countless movements. Psychologists note that people are more likely to stay loyal after making significant sacrifices. If you've sold your home, given your savings, or cut ties with friends because you believed in a prophecy, walking away when it fails is extremely difficult. Admitting you were wrong means admitting those sacrifices were for nothing. To avoid that painful realization, people double down, clinging even harder to the belief. This is known as the sunk cost fallacy, and it plays a huge role in why failed predictions keep their hold. The sunk cost fallacy works hand in hand with group reinforcement. In apocalyptic movements, doubts are discouraged. When everyone around you continues believing, it's easier to suppress your own questions than to risk standing out. That social pressure can be overwhelming, especially in tightly knit communities. It's not just about belief, it's about belonging. Leaving the belief often means leaving the group, which for many feels unthinkable. This is why end times predictions often create echo chambers. Information that contradicts the prophecy is dismissed as deception, while anything that vaguely supports it is amplified. A natural disaster, a war, an economic downturn, these become proof of the prophecy's truth. While the countless times nothing happens are ignored, this selective filter ensures the belief always finds evidence, no matter how many failures accumulate. But while these mechanisms explain why failed predictions persist, they also expose the fragility of the system, because at its core, it requires constant reinterpretation. Each failure demands a new explanation, a new timeline, a new twist in the story. The prophecy never delivers on its promise, so it survives by endlessly shifting the goalposts. And the more it shifts, the more obvious it becomes that it's not really about truth. It's about maintaining the narrative at any cost. That cost is not just abstract, it's measurable in human lives. Think of the countless people who have delayed education, postponed marriages, drained their savings, or alienated loved ones because they thought the end was imminent. These are not small sacrifices, they reshape entire lives. And when the prophecy fails, those losses don't magically disappear. People are left with regret, disillusionment, and often shame. There are even cases where the psychological toll has been devastating. Some followers spiral into depression after a failed prophecy. Others struggle with anger at being misled. A few, tragically, have taken their own lives, unable to cope with the collapse of the worldview that gave them meaning. These are not isolated stories. They are part of the recurring pattern of harm that failed predictions leave behind. Even when the harm is in extreme, the long-term effects are still corrosive, and people who build their lives around the expectation of an imminent end may neglect their health, finances, or relationships. They may live in constant fear, always scanning the news for signs of doom. This anxiety can become a permanent part of their identity, shaping how they think, feel, and act. And because the prophecy never resolves, the anxiety never truly ends. It just lingers year after year. And at the same time, leaders who profit from these predictions rarely face accountability. When one date fails, they simply pivot to another. Followers forgive or forget, and the cycle begins again. The leader's reputation may take a hit among outsiders, but inside the group they often emerge stronger, framed as faithful guides who endured a test along with their followers. This lack of accountability is one reason failed predictions keep repeating. The people making them have little to lose and much to gain. But here's the paradox. While failed predictions can devastate individual lives, they almost never devastate the belief system itself. If anything, they prove how resilient the system is. A worldview that can survive centuries of total failure is astonishingly durable. And that durability is exactly why it continues to shape so many lives today. It's easy to laugh at failed predictions when looking from the outside. The Great Disappointment, Harold Camping, the Mayan calendar, Y2K, all of them seem absurd in hindsight. But inside the movements, they were not jokes. They were life-defining moments. That's why understanding the psychology behind them matters. Without recognizing the deep needs these beliefs fulfill, it's impossible to understand why they keep returning. And so the cycle continues. New leaders rise, new predictions spread, new dates are marked on calendars. And when they fail, as they always do, the same explanations, the same rationalizations, the same justifications are rolled out. The cast changes, but the script stays the same. One of the most striking things about failed end times predictions is how quickly they fade from public memory. For a brief moment, they dominate headlines, fill airwaves, and capture people's imaginations. But once the date passes uneventfully, the story dies almost overnight. The world shrugs, moves on, and soon forgets. This collective amnesia makes it easy for the next prediction to gain traction, because the public rarely dwells on the track record. Consider how much attention the May 2011 rapture prediction received. Billboards across the world, international media coverage, and countless discussions online. Yet within weeks of its failure, it became a punchline, then a forgotten footnote. A decade later, many people barely remember it happened. That forgetfulness is part of why failed predictions can recycle endlessly. They don't linger long enough in the public mind to poison the pool well for future attempts. This cycle of hype and amnesia also reveals how entertainment value plays a role. Apocalyptic predictions are dramatic, cinematic, and emotionally gripping. They're good stories, and media outlets know that good stories draw attention. So even when predictions are baseless, they often get amplified because fear and drama sell. This gives them a much bigger platform than they deserve, which in turn recruits new believers. But media isn't the only culprit. Like, human beings are naturally drawn to the extraordinary. The idea that you're living at the climax of history is far more exciting than believing you're part of an ordinary ongoing story. That desire for significance makes people more receptive to end times narratives. It's not just about fear of destruction, it's about thrill of importance. Believing the world is ending makes you feel like your life is playing out on the biggest possible stage, and there's another factor too: control. Predicting the end of the world, or following someone who claims to, creates the illusion of control over chaos. The future may be terrifying, but if you know what's coming, you feel prepared. Even when predictions fail, that feeling of preparedness can linger, making people reluctant to abandon the framework that gave them a sense of mastery over the unknown. But the irony is that these frameworks don't actually prepare people. They leave them vulnerable. Instead of investing in practical resilience, like education, savings, healthcare, or climate adaptation, believers pour energy into spiritual or symbolic preparation for an apocalypse that never arrives. When reality demands concrete solutions, they're left unprepared because they spent years preparing for the wrong crisis. History is full of examples of this misplaced focus. Farmers in the Millerite movement abandoned their crops because they believed the end was at hand. When it didn't happen, they were left hungry and destitute. Families in the 20th century drained their savings to spread apocalyptic warnings, only to be left in financial ruin when the world kept going. And in smaller, more extreme groups, members have even given up their lives in tragic mass suicides. This is why it's not enough to point out that predictions fail. The harm they cause needs to be acknowledged. They don't just waste time, they actively damage people's lives and erode society's ability to address real problems. By focusing on imaginary deadlines, people neglect the real ticking clocks: climate change, political instability, pandemics, technological risks. These are genuine threats that require collective action, but apocalyptic thinking reframes them as divine signs, which absolves believers of responsibility. If anything, this mindset amplifies the danger, because when people believe disasters are inevitable and divinely ordained, they may actually welcome them. Wars, famines, and ecological collapse aren't seen as crises to be solved. They're seen as proof that prophecy is true. This fatalistic approach can lead to indifference or even eagerness for suffering. After all, in apocalyptic narratives, suffering is a sign that salvation is near. This inversion of values is deeply troubling. Instead of striving to prevent catastrophe, people come to see catastrophe as desirable. Instead of resisting destruction, they embrace it as destiny. And when large numbers of people hold that mindset, it makes collective action far harder. If your neighbor believes the world is ending in a few years, why would they care about the consequences of pollution, poverty, or war? Why would they support policies that protect future generations they don't believe will exist? This shows how failed predictions, though laughable on the surface, have profound social consequences. They don't just let individuals down, they undermine the broader effort to build a sustainable and just world. And yet, despite all of this, new predictions are always on the horizon. Already, voices are pointing to the latest global crises, pandemics, climate disasters, wars, as proof that the end is near. They recycle the same verses, the same warnings, the same confidence, and many people, perhaps weary from chaos and uncertainty, are listening. It's tempting to think that one day the cycle will break, that people will finally recognize the pattern and walk away for good. But history suggests otherwise. As long as humans crave meaning, certainty, and closure, there will always be a market for end times predictions. They may evolve and form, blending religious prophecy with conspiracy theory or mixing ancient texts with modern fears. but the substance remains the same, which leaves us with the sobering conclusion: the failure of predictions isn't the real story. The real story is the human need that keeps them alive. Until those needs are addressed in healthier ways, the predictions will keep coming. It's worth asking why some people seem more vulnerable to end times predictions than others. Not everyone who hears a warning about the apocalypse takes it seriously. For many, it's background noise, something to laugh at or dismiss. But for others, it becomes life-defining. The difference often lies in personal circumstances. Periods of uncertainty make people more open to apocalyptic thinking. Someone who just lost a job, who feels alienated, or who sees society as unstable may be more receptive to the idea that everything is collapsing. End times predictions tap into that anxiety and reframe it as evidence of prophecy. Instead of random misfortune, personal hardship becomes part of a cosmic plan. That makes suffering feel less meaningless, which can be a powerful comfort. Cultural background matters too. In communities where apocalyptic preaching is common, children grow up hearing about the end of the world as though it's fact. By the time they're adults, the idea is ingrained so deeply that questioning it feels like betrayal. Entire social networks reinforce the belief. Friends, family, and leaders all share the same worldview, making it extremely difficult for anyone to step outside of it. Education and exposure to diverse perspectives also play a role. When people learn history, they see how many failed predictions came before. When they understand psychology, they recognize the tricks of cognitive dissonance. When they study science, they grasp the natural causes behind disasters. This broader understanding makes them less likely to interpret every event as a divine signal. But without that knowledge, apocalyptic claims can seem far more convincing. The digital age complicates this even further. On one hand, information has never been more accessible. Anyone can quickly find the long record of failed prophecies. But on the other hand, misinformation spreads just as easily. Social media creates echo chambers where end times claims circulate without challenge. Videos warning of imminent apocalypse gather millions of views, often shared by algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy. This creates an environment where failed predictions don't just survive, they thrive. The result is that failed predictions are more global than ever. A preacher in one country can now reach audiences across the world instantly. What once might have been a local panic can now become an international event. The 2012 Mayan calendar prediction showed this clearly. It spread worldwide, affecting people on every continent, despite having no real basis in history or science. The global reach also means that failed predictions now intersect with politics more directly. Politicians aware of apocalyptic belief can exploit it to their advantage. By framing opponents as part of the end times battle, they rally voters through fear and urgency. Policies can be justified not on their merits, but on the claim that they align with prophecy. This blend of religion, fear, and politics creates a potent force that influences societies in ways that extend far beyond the pulpit. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how adaptable apocalyptic predictions are across cultures. They're not unique to Christianity. Nearly every major religion has some form of end-time story. Ancient Zoroastrianism predicted a final battle between good and evil. Hindu texts describe cycles of destruction and renewal. Islamic traditions speak of the Day of Judgment. These diverse stories share the same pattern, warnings of imminent collapse that never quite arrive. This suggests the impulse toward apocalyptic thinking isn't tied to one religion, but to human psychology itself. It's also why secular versions of apocalyptic predictions exist. Even outside of religion, people warn of imminent doom from technology, politics, or the environment. Sometimes these warnings are grounded in real risks, like nuclear war or climate change, but often they're exaggerated into absolute certainty, not "we face challenges," but "the world will end within years." These secular apocalypses follow the same cycle as religious ones. Predictions, hype, failure, forgetfulness, repetition. All of this points back to the same human need. We long for clarity, closure, and meaning in the face of uncertainty. We want to know that history has direction and purpose. We want to believe that injustice won't last forever. End times predictions, even when wrong, provide all of that in a neat, dramatic package, and so we keep returning to them, century after century. But there's an alternative. Instead of waiting for the world to end, we can recognize that meaning is something we create, not something imposed from outside. Justice isn't delivered by cosmic intervention. It's achieved through human action. The future isn't written in prophecy. It's shaped by the choices we make. That perspective is harder because it requires responsibility, but it's also more honest and ultimately more empowering, because while the world hasn't ended, civilizations have, and they didn't fall because of prophecy. They fell because of neglect, greed, and poor decisions. That's a lesson worth remembering, and the danger isn't in a divine timetable. It's in ignoring reality while chasing after one. Looking back at the long history of failed end times predictions, the pattern is unmistakable. The dates shift, the leaders change, the signs get reinterpreted, but the outcome never changes. The world keeps going. Humanity wakes up the next day and life continues. The accuracy rate is 0, yet the cycle never ends. That's because these predictions aren't really about the future. They're about the present. They're about the fears people carry, the anxieties of the moment, and the longing for certainty. The apocalypse has always been less about what will happen and more about how people feel right now. It's a mirror that reflects our insecurities and our hopes, not a window into the future. This is why the failure of predictions doesn't stop them, because the needs they fulfill, meaning justice, belonging, closure, don't disappear just because a prophecy fails. If anything, failure makes those needs even sharper. And so the cycle continues, not because it works, but because people need it to work. But here's the paradox. While apocalyptic predictions are always wrong, the world does face real threats: wars, pandemics, environmental collapse, technological risks. These are not divine punishments or prophetic signs, but human-made problems. And unlike prophecy, they are within our power to change. The real danger is that apocalyptic thinking distracts us from addressing them. Instead of taking responsibility, people surrender to fatalism, convinced that nothing can stop what's coming. The tragedy is that this surrender becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because the world is destined to end, but because people act as though it is. When enough people stop planning for the future, stop caring for the planet, stop striving for justice, the future becomes darker, not because of divine decree, but because of human neglect. That's why exposing the cycle of failed predictions matters, not just to point out the absurdity of another wrong date on the calendar, but to show what's at stake when people invest their lives in fantasies of doom. The cost is too high: broken families, wasted resources, shattered hopes, and a society that looks away from real problems while waiting for imaginary ones. And yet, the fact that every prediction has failed also tells us something hopeful. It shows that the world is far more resilient than doomsayers admit. It shows that despite wars, disasters, and crises, humanity continues. We adapt, we rebuild, we create. The future is not a fixed script hurtling toward destruction. It's an open story, still being written by us. The choice is whether we keep surrendering that story to false prophets and failed predictions, or whether we take responsibility for writing it ourselves. That doesn't mean ignoring real dangers. It means facing them honestly, without wrapping them in mythology. It means recognizing that the end is not inevitable, but neither is progress. Both depend on what we do now. The endless cycle of failed predictions should remind us of one simple truth: the world has never ended on schedule, and it probably won't. But our actions today will shape the kind of world that continue, and whether it's just or unjust, thriving or collapsing, hopeful or hopeless, that depends not on prophecy, but on us. So the next time someone says the end is near, remember the pattern, remember the track record, and remember that while apocalyptic stories may fail again and again, the real story of humanity is still unfolding, and it's one we get to shape, not one written in a crumbling book of failed predictions.